This brown bag series is part of our LDL as Data project. Our LDL as Data project is funded by and part of a larger project called Collections as Data, which is an effort made possible by the Mellon Foundation. What do we mean when we talk about collections as data? We mean using our digital cultural heritage collections, digitized letters, maps, photos, etc., in computational analysis, such as text analysis, text encoding, like we'll be talking about today, digital mapping, and more. We are part of a 6-team cohort charged with creating examples of how to implement and use cultural heritage materials as data, and this fellowship is part of that work. Our specific grant project is titled "And 25 of Our Closest Friends, the LDL as Community-Focused Data." And the main idea of this project was to explore what it would look like to offer all contents of the LDL as data. The project took on 2 tracks. There's the technology side and the community side. On the tech side, we considered LDL deliverables such as bulk download, machine readable rights statements, and proper restriction rules. And on the community side, we ask questions like, is this something that all of our LDL participants would want? The LDL is composed of over 30 contributing institutions, public libraries, academic libraries, cultural heritage museums, government repositories, and all of those voices matter. Is this something that's appropriate for all collections within the LDL? Some contain culturally sensitive subject matter and should be handled with particular care. And how can we consider the ethical implications as well as the promise of collections as data at the LDL level? I think this fellowship is a perfect merger of the 2 tracks of our overall grant project, technology and community. Our fellows have created LDL as data use cases for future researchers, teachers, students. So they're providing ways that our LDL data can be used alongside digital tools. And they're doing this in part to guide and inspire our community of users and contributors. We've got some upcoming brown bag talks. On November 18th, we will hear from Isabel Haynes, a sonic map of New Orleans. And alongside her, we'll see special guest Molly Mitchell-Neal, who's going to talk about Freedom on the Move, which is a database of fugitives from American slavery. And then on December 7th, we'll hear from Victoria Elmwood. She will present her project, The Body Web, mapping primary digital resources for the study of sex work in New Orleans. And we will, alongside her, have special guest Kate Schuster of the Hard History Project. But today, we are hearing from Alexandra Chason. She is a PhD in English candidate at LSU. Her work is on sex and the internet, and she focuses on platform design and its impact on how we talk about sexuality. The working title of her dissertation is Sexuality and the Digital Platform Economy.
All right, thanks so much for coming, everyone. I'm really excited about the possibilities that my project, I feel, is opening up for us with this item in the collection. There's a lot of great stuff in there. I couldn't think of a project to do on the doll collection, which is basically photos of dolls that's in the Louisiana Digital Library. If I had thought of a project, I might be giving you a presentation on creepy little dolls from around the world right now. But I felt like what I landed on with the Civil Code of Louisiana from 1825 was exciting enough. So, but maybe next year we'll talk about dolls. I just find that to be such an amazing digital collection item. It's just a bunch of photos of dolls from around the world, which you can look at in the LDL.
If you submit that proposal, you will be a fellow next year.
Yes, I'll just be a 2-timer. I mean, I've got to come up with something to do with those dolls because they're so amazing and strange. So I've given you just a little overview of how I'm going to break everything up. I'm going to give you some context in terms of why I was interested in the Civil Code and sort of where I'm coming from as teacher in English and women's gender and sexuality studies. Tell you a little bit about the project, which is in progress, and the uses that I'm currently imagining. And then hopefully we can conclude with if you have any questions for me, but mainly I'd love to hear from anyone who has ideas about more things that we can do with this collection item. Okay, so like Leah said, I'm a PhD candidate in English and WGS, and my research is on sexuality in the internet. I'm really interested in platform design specifically and the economic situation that's come out of platform capitalism. And so I think a lot about persuasive technologies and how especially like social media platforms, also known as advertising platforms, influence us to engage in different behaviors and think about things in certain ways, talk about things in certain ways, and then how that translates to our idea of sexuality today. So that's kind of my background. And I'm a 5th year, and as part of my assistantship for the PhD program, I'm teaching at least one class a semester, though sometimes I take on an extra one for a little extra money because, as you know, graduate students are poor. So, but I've taught 2 levels of English composition, 10,000, which is like kind of like a freshman level, and then a 2nd level, which is English. So 1001 is the freshman level and 2000 is like a sophomore level, but really it's students from all different points in their college time at LSU. And then I've also had an amazing opportunity last semester to teach women's gender and sexuality studies, a sort of introductory class, WGS 2500. And had a great time looking at a lot of great texts that are sort of important in the field, watched a lot of documentaries. And so that's sort of my background as an educator as well, and I'll talk more about that as it's relevant to this project. So the Louisiana Civil Code is really interesting. So the 1825 Code was sort of an opportunity for French rule to sort of assert themselves and replace the pre-existing Spanish codes. And civil code can refer to, a civil code deals with private law. So that refers to like property, family, contracts, divorces, succession, inheritances, all of these kind of things. And it's unique in this country because Louisiana, I'm not a legal scholar, by the way. So if anyone wants to fact check me in the chat, you're welcome to do so. This is just my like very functional knowledge. And I think I'm right, but feel free to fact check me. No insecurities there. This is not my expertise. But anyway, as I was saying, the Louisiana Civil Code is really interesting because we still have that basis, and we're the only state that still has that sort of legal heritage of the Civil Code, which comes from other European codes. Many people think of it as like the Napoleonic Code, but with my research, I found that it's actually this specific civil code from 1825 is actually drawing from civil codes that might have been influenced by the Napoleonic Code, but then the Napoleonic Code was influenced by other civil codes. So it's really more just influenced by European civil codes at the time. What the rest of the United States has is a common law system, which is basically like this idea of legal precedence is sort of how you make a case in the common law courts, in civil courts. So sort of relying on what has happened in past court cases. And that's what the rest of the country is doing. We are still sort of guided by this civil code. And the 1825 code is when it sort of switched over to the French version of that. Though I believe the pre-existing Spanish codes prior to 1825, it seems like they were like maybe kind of similar, but this one has a distinct sort of French flair. And so it's important to remember that when I'm looking at this legal document, guides interactions between individuals as opposed to like a criminal system, which would deal with the state and the greater population that way. So you're not going to see like in this civil code, you're not going to see a lot of like criminal offenses in there. It's really more dealing with sort of like the state as the mediator between two parties. So my project takes a look at this document and gathers articles that mention sex and gender. And in this case, especially how sex is sort of a category and females are inherently different from males in the phrasing in this code. And I really just want to use this text as as a way to examine the language around sex and gender at this time. And there are some examples of sexual behavior. I'll talk more about why I put sexuality in the title in a little bit, but I'm just going to refer to it as sort of sexual behavior as it shows up in the code. Okay, so this is how you can view the Civil Code of 1825 in the LDL. There's a document viewer, which takes the scanned document, and you can click up at the top, there's view text only, and that sort of, there's software that transcribes the text so that it's copy and pastable. And it's mostly right. There needs to be some cleaning, as I'll talk about later, if you're copy and pasting from the text, but it's a long document. Yeah, really fascinating. I've looked through most of it. It's also interesting because on the left page, it's in English, and on the right page, it's in French. And so it would, I'll talk about this later. I think it'd be really interesting to have someone retranslate the French to see how accurate the original English translation was. And I couldn't find anywhere the information whether it was drafted in French or whether it was drafted in English, but I think that finding out more about that translation would also be interesting for further research with this document. So here are some examples of some of the articles in the document. The wife may also claim a separation in case of adultery on the part of her husband when he has kept his concubine in their common dwelling. I think that's so interesting. It sounds very New Orleans. It sounds like a very New Orleans problem to have. This is obviously a statewide code. So, I am not a historian of Louisiana. I think there maybe are some historians in this meeting today. So feel free to add comments on this in the chat. But I just, there's just interesting little articles like this the phrasing is so interesting to me. I loved reading through it and just sort of seeing like what was kind of like illegal at the time, or what would be grounds for divorce. Adultery is talked about a lot. Women who on account of their sex cannot be judges and are likewise incapable of being named arbitrators. So in settling these disputes, you cannot use your aunt who has great powers of discernment. That would not have been legal at this time. And this is interesting. It talks about the language. It actually comments and clarifies the language used in the rest of the document, which I thought was very interesting, which is the masculine gender comprehends the two sexes wherever the provision is not one, which is evidently made for one of them only. Thus, the word man or men includes women. The word son or sons includes daughters. The words he, his, and such like are applicable to both males and females. So I thought it was kind of charitable that they at least clarified that they were going to use predominantly masculine language, unless they were referring to wives, of course. And so women are most often referred to as, based on my research so far anyway, and the textual analysis I've done so far, women are most often referred to as married women or wives in this document. So before I show you exactly what I was doing, I do want to kind of comment on why I was interested in this. So as I said, I taught an introductory course in women's gender and sexuality studies last spring, and I was really struck by my students really, like, I would call a preoccupation with basically wanting to historicize the topics we discussed in class. They really loved reading older texts and imagining other contexts and time periods outside of their own. And it surprised me a bit, but it really shouldn't have, because I like to tell people, like, a couple years ago, I offered extra credit to my composition students. It was mostly sophomores in the class. And I offered extra credit to attend a lecture from a scholar named Jeremy Molderig. And he edited an autobiography from a man named Samuel Stewart. He's relatively unknown, but he actually is a really fascinating figure in gay history. He was an English professor and a tattoo artist, an erotic novelist, and he was also friends with Gertrude Stein and Alfred Kinsey. Like, this was a crazy guy, truly remarkable person. And he also had this interesting little quirk that really fascinated me, where he documented like thousands of sexual encounters he had with hundreds of men, and he kept them in an index file. And so I'm kind of like obsessed with him because he was so weird. And he lived in Chicago. And a lot of the, when he was documenting his sexual encounters, it was sort of from like the 1920s through the 60s or so. It was like primarily when he was active. So I'm obsessed with him. But I didn't know that the lecture was going to be about this man, or what the topic of the lecture was going to be ahead of time when I offered the extra credit to my composition students from like all different majors, right? And so I had one student show up, and it was a surprising student. And he wrote in his reflection for the event that he thought gay people didn't exist until the 90s. And I was like, oh, cool, like, you've read Foucault, like, but no, like, he meant like the 1990s. And so, like, yeah, so now my life's purpose is definitely to help students sort of encounter historical texts, teach them a little history whenever I can, whenever it's relevant, in the composition classroom especially, provide them a little context for these things, because realistically, like, my composition class is a writing class, but the way I style it, it definitely feels like a humanities class. You know, between those composition classes that are more like humanities classes, and my WGS introduction class, this may be one of the few true humanities courses that my students are able to take in college. And so, you know, my discipline is English. You know, I feel like an amateur historian in a lot of ways. I don't have that formal training, but I am interested in archives and thinking critically about what is in them. And so I think that's probably good enough for sharing information with undergraduate students, especially if it can help them sort of reorient their worldviews. So anyway, I like to give a little narrative evidence for why I even want to do this work in the first place. It's just, yeah, I mean, you know, I don't have time to completely learn all of the conventions of the discipline of history, but I can maybe gather a few skills along the way to, you know, kind of help my students see a greater context than what they're, you know, immediately seeing in their present lives. And they have a craving for that based on my experience. They really, really have a desire to know what the world was like, especially like pre-social media, I guess. So I, you know, it makes it feel meaningful when I do work like this. So as I said, I'm looking for articles relevant to sex, gender, sexual behavior, and marriage in the code. And I've been transcribing and cleaning up the text taken from the code. I'm working on that right now. I think I'm maybe like halfway done because I was originally going to keep out articles related to succession because there are so many of them, but then I found it kind of interesting. In succession, by succession, I mean, you know, who's going to inherit the family property. Also, I was kind of got re-interested in Succession because I'm watching Succession, the television show, which is a fantastic HBO show. So I definitely didn't originally plan to spend so much time in the succession sections of this code, but ended up being kind of interesting, the differences between sons and daughters and what they could actually inherit. So I'm transcribing, I'm cleaning up the code, and the way I've been just sort of taking my notes, I've been including the article number, page number, and then I have some key term tags I've been using, and then I include the full text of the article. Like I said, I think I mentioned this earlier, but in copy and pasting the full text of the article, you know, it's a little wonky sometimes, and I couldn't find a full already transcribed version of this code, so I really am doing a lot of this manually. But it has this text recognition software built into what the LDL is offering for us. But I still have to, like, you know, take out a period here, turn a colon into a semicolon, things like that. So the deliverable that I think might actually be included on the website, if I think is what Leah said, it will be a CSV version of just the full text from the articles, but researchers who are working with this might want to also get access to my full document with my tags. People who are actually historians might suggest new tags, which I would be open to. And, you know, this is just sort of a more casual way for me to reference the document myself. Let's see. So, okay, so here are the coding terms I've been using. So I'm still deciding how I want to frame gender versus sex. So right now I've been using gender to refer to like the legal terms, which, as I showed you in an example in an earlier slide, they do explain why they use certain words over others. And so there are a couple instances of just commenting on the language of the code itself. So I've been using gender to mark that. And then I use sex to mark articles where they explicitly say women are this way and men are this way. So as a result, women cannot do this thing. So I've been using sex for that. And if they're talking about sort of like daughters versus sons or whatever, obviously this code is functioning within a concept of a gender binary, just to be clear, if that wasn't obvious. It was 1825. So they're really talking about sex here, but, you know, I feel like I could think through the coding a little more. I think this is functional for now for what I'm trying to do in terms of a pedagogical tool. So there's a lot about marriage. Obviously, it's a civil code. There are a lot of rules. It's especially interesting, all of the grounds for divorce. If you kick your wife out of the house, it's grounds for divorce. Family is obviously really interesting. This was 1825. So there are many articles concerning enslaved people. So, you know, that's kind of maybe like a content warning, or at least like I want to highlight it for people doing research in this collection. There is maybe less about enslaved people than I would have expected in terms of the economy of slavery at this time, but there's a lot in there in terms of children you have, men who have with slaves, and how and to what extent they are recognized. And then I've been also coding sexual behavior, though it's largely pertaining to adultery. And then you saw the article that I shared referring to concubines. And it's not explicit whether or not the concubines are slaves in the code, though I know from my own background that there's a high probability that they are free descendants of enslaved people, the most common concubines, especially in New Orleans. But again, historians in the chat are you know, welcome to add more on that topic. It's not my expertise, though I'm learning a lot more through this project, and we'll learn more as I work to teach this document to students. Okay, so my project is pedagogically focused. So I do plan to develop some lesson plans that I will use in college classrooms, both in composition and women's gender studies. So people can use those. I think also it might be interesting to use with advanced high school students. And I think there are a lot of angles for analyzing the data set. So thus far, I think it's really important that anyone using the data set also spends time just sort of flipping through the full code in the LDL and just sort of getting acquainted with the full spectrum of all the things that there were laws about, and what sort of the tone was, which was, very like I think attempting to be unbiased at the time, though of course we can consider who was writing these laws, which I think should be obvious, but maybe not, was largely wealthy white male property owners, because this is a civil code and it's concerned primarily with property and who's going to get what at what time, and who's entitled to what in contracts. So I'm interested, so far, some of the things that I've noted would questions like, where on the lineup does the article fall? Is it something that's mentioned early and often, or is it kind of a side note? Like the concubine article feels almost kind of like a side note, like they needed to throw that in because it was a persistent enough problem that women wanted to divorce their husbands because he had moved a concubine into the house, moved another woman into the house, maybe is a more charitable way to say that. What might this say about the priorities of the time? The regularity of the tags appearing. So, again, this is my casual coding. People might develop their own, but what was important to the writers, the rich white male property owners. And then also where are their conspicuous absences? So what's not in the code? I noted that I was surprised that there was less commenting on the economy of slavery in the code. I would love to hear from a historian about why that may be, why there wasn't maybe more in there. I think, so I included sexuality in my title for the project. Since I'm in sexuality studies, that's sort of my field, and we don't really think about sexuality being a thing until the birth of homosexuality as a concept. And, Foucault dates this at 1870. So obviously this code was written long before sexuality, as far as I see it and many other scholars see it, was really a thing in the way we talk about it, being sort of like an identity or an orientation. And that also is true for the way our students and people outside the field may view the matter, that, sexuality is sort of like an identity or something you're born with or things like that. And so this code is really before those ideas come about. And so, in later instances, in other codes, we may see more sort of like criminalization of certain sexual behaviors, your run-of-the-mill crimes against nature, bestiality, sodomy, etc., in other legal codes, but probably not so much in a civil code, and probably especially not one published in 1825. That sort of all came later. But still, I find that like looking through the gaps and what this code does not include and reading that absence is sort of a productive exercise, particularly with undergraduate students learning about the history of sexuality, for example. And oh, by the way, Tara Cunningham is putting fantastic comments and resources, explanations about the civil code in the chat. So please take a look at those. Okay, so a couple of the tools that I plan to use in my lesson plans is I think a lot of librarians are in the meeting, so you probably know about these, but the way I'm envisioning it is using something like Voyant to identify textual patterns. So I actually pulled this up with what I've coded so far. And I'll draw your attention to, this. So what I've coded so far is largely about instances of when women are mentioned or when wives are mentioned. But as you can see, husband is the biggest word, which I think is just an immediate observation, which is that, it's really like a guideline for the husband. All of these articles that mention wives are also sort of like, in what ways do they need to submit to their husband? But there are some interesting articles about when can a wife take her husband to court because he's not doing what he's supposed to do in terms of taking care of her. It's also interesting that women do have some property rights at this time. And if men are sort of if their husbands are sort of infringing on some of those limited rights, then they can go to court and let a judge decide. Of course, it's a big question mark what a judge would have, if they would have decided in a woman's favor. But there are some protections for women at this time that I found interesting, that I think students would find interesting and perhaps surprising. But yeah, there's a lot that can be done. There's also same diff, which I would like to use to compare the 1825 code with other codes going forward, or else what I've pulled from the 1825 code versus the full code, if that is ever fully transcribed. And yeah, I think it would be interesting to use it as a comparison tool with other codes, or maybe, yeah, I think there's a lot of options there. Let's see. So I still think there's more work that could be done by other people going forward to kind of make this a more useful tool in the LDL. So I think a full transcription of the code, which I could not find anywhere. I mean, I think it's still valuable to look at this original document, even if it does exist. But a full transcription of the code and other legal documents for comparison would be interesting. I think there's maybe a handful in the law library, but a full PDF version of the text would be very interesting, or a text document of the full code would be very interesting. As I mentioned earlier, retranslation I think would be fascinating. I don't know French. If I did, I would love to do something like this to kind of see, if the English matches the French. And also, like I said, I would like to know whether it was sort of drafted in English or if it was drafted in French. I think it was probably drafted in French, but maybe a historian can answer that question. And if so, then a retranslation and sort of revisiting what the French actually says would be very interesting for anyone studying this. Expanding the data set, I think would be cool in terms of, maybe there are other angles. I focused kind of on like gender and sex differences, but if other people had other angles, I mean, I think that we could kind of tag the articles collectively in this code, and I think it could be very functional as a learning tool. And then I think it would be great to use this as maybe just an interesting artifact to share with students, really advanced high school students or college students. I intend to teach with it in the future, just because I think it's important that they see kind of like what the legal scene was like, especially since, we in teaching, especially in WGS, like Kimberly Crenshaw and things like that, and scholars like that, thinking really critically about the legal system in terms of race and gender intersectionality. It would be so cool to show this and then also teach Kimberly Crenshaw or similar scholars sort of at the same time. So I think there's a lot of opportunities with this. And yeah, I would love to hear from anyone who has suggestions with things to do with this collection. and you're welcome to email me. Yeah, I'll answer questions. So yeah. Oh, and Tara Cunningham commented that there is a professor in the Law Center who's done a translation back to the French, and it's available online. So that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And that's all
Thank
for
you,
me. Let me know if
Alexandra.
you have any questions.
Yes, I know that I have some. We are going to pass it off to Caitlin for a few minutes to look at some of Delgado's new LDL collections. And then with any time we have at the end, we can ask questions and share comments. There are some really great comments in the chat right now. So Caitlin, I see you. Are you able to share your screen?
I surely am. Let me do that right now. One of the more fun, I put a number of new collections in over the last 2 years, and one of the more fun ones is this toolkit. This old 1920s sort of newslettery publication of Delgado from the 1920s. This one is from 1926. And I just pulled this up because this page up because I thought it was pretty fun that it talks about how one by one our faculty are becoming members of the great motoring fraternity. The erstwhile semi-vacant stalls of the community garage back on Gasoline Alley now suggest a public parking space at theater time. So, you know, more people were getting into their own automobiles, this being the 1920s. This is interesting because around this time, I think it started in 1927, my neighborhood, Gentilly Terrace, was, I think, the first subdivision of New Orleans that was built with the idea that everybody had cars. And that was started being built around this time. So I thought that was interesting. But as you see, we have quite a few of those that I scanned, and some have nice little pictures in them. And there was one really hilarious excerpt that I found when I was doing this that I think was satire, but I'm not sure, on how one should behave at school. It was pretty funny, but I couldn't quite find that again. But this is from the Classroom Candids. The Delgado Alumni Banquet and Classroom Candid photos, just various photos that I didn't really have, I just kind of put them in because that one thing. But this one I thought was interesting. This is a student at an old Braille reader. And I thought that was pretty fun. So there's some cool photographs like that. I thought seeing the Braille reader was interesting. And another interesting one would be this printer annual. This is something out in this is a few publications from the 60s, that we had, and we still had a print shop at that time. Here's the whole history of the printing department with some cool pictures of machines and things like that. So we have those from the 60s, not as many of those as we do of the toolkit. And we have the toolkit is from the 20s. And
Caitlin, how is the OCR? How's the full text of the toolkit? I know Alexandra was saying that on the Civil Code it was slightly messy.
Oh yeah, probably is. It's
That's
not
unavailable.
showing. Yeah, and I will say that I think it's moving a little slowly because initially when I went into book view, it wasn't showing my images.
Okay.
So I think sometimes it does move a little slowly. And that might be part of the thing right now. But oh, here's something fun. I remember seeing this when I was doing it. Look at the costume designed by a student annual style show, Nichols Industrial School. I thought that was fun.
Reflections on the nose. I loved that.
Yes. What is the
Incredible.
difference between a kiss over the phone and a straw hat? It's not felt. Oh goodness. And so it's pretty interesting as far as seeing what the society was like back then.
Do you know did you mention the circulation for this? Was it just the student body?
The what? Oh,
I-
these seem to be, particularly the toolkits. Yeah, they were definitely aimed at the Delgado student body. You know, like I said, they had that thing about how you should behave on campus. That was pretty funny, and all the stuff the students are doing. Luca Dewey just bought a new dog.
Thanks for sharing, Caitlin. This has been really
Oh,
fun.
you're welcome. So the toolkits are fun. They're the 1920s, and they've got pictures and interesting text. And if you got a number of collections here, and between the shelves is the old library newsletter and so forth. So fun stuff.
Thanks. Well, we have a few minutes if anyone has any questions for Caitlin or Alexandra. Alexandra, I had a question. It's when you're tagging the articles with words like marriage, gender, sex, etc. Were you using sort of a controlled vocabulary that you developed, and how did you come up with that? Was it just sort of as topics arose?
So it was like mildly arbitrary, though I think that if I had to articulate it in writing, it might become clearer to me. But I think it's sort of, I approached it, what is the article's purpose and what is it dealing with most directly? And so I use multiple tags for an article, for articles. So I'm not just like picking one, I'm just sort of including all that was sort of mentioned. So I think that like the one, like because I used gender to describe like the gendered language in the addressing the specific language, which of course is important for law, that is not used as often as like sex, where it's just sort of like, so like an example is one article has to do with, what was it? It was like a specific action. It was similar to the arbitrator one where they couldn't do a specific legal task. And it was like, the following individuals could not do a specific task. And then it would be like women, minors, and then, the language of the time, obviously, they said it was like women, minors, and then like idiots or like invalids or something. Obviously, we would use different words now, but in the code, that's what it says. And so if it's something like that where women are specifically mentioned as not, being legally allowed to do something, then I would tag that as sex, because I consider that they're sort of distinguishing an inherent difference between men and women. And so like it would be often like women can't do this and neither can boys up to the age of, or boys younger than 16. So basically like when you hit 16, then you have authority over your mother or whatever. So anyway, so the tagging system is like maybe like mildly arbitrary, but I'm reading each article. I'm not just sort of like quickly like control finding to look for the words that the key words that I've identified. And I have looked through the code like in its entirety, and that's how I came up with my search terms to begin with. And the search terms included like women, wives. It's not especially helpful to use men because that's like the default, obviously. And it's more interesting, I think, whenever there's a differentiation made. So women, wives, daughters, and then yeah, I did like sex, gender, search terms. I have a bunch of them which I can share. I have to look at my notes again. But yeah, I came up with those search terms based on reading the document and knowing that that's where I was going to find the information I was looking for. But the coding, like I said, I mean, kind of using that for my own purposes for teaching. So someone who has expertise in sort of coding like that and on that level might have better feedback for me on how to improve that system. For me, I'm just trying to be functional. So
yeah, I could imagine a lot of functions for those tags though, if, for data visualization that we could work on together at some point, or even creating like a digital edition that groups articles by subject heading in the way that the LDL does could be really cool.
Absolutely.
So there was a question about OCR, which I passed on to Elisa as someone who is more expert in that to me. And the OCR is generated by Islandora using an external OCR engine. So that was Gerald Jones had asked what OCR engine is used to generate OCR. And it is generated on the digital library platform, but always requires some cleaning up, as I'm sure we all know. If there is any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself and share. Otherwise, I will start to wrap this up. I did want to share that our first issue of the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship is out, and it features papers derived from some of the talks given last year during our LDLS Data Speaker Series. And we are currently accepting submissions for our spring 2022 issue. So email me if you want to talk about any ideas involving a critical lens and digital librarianship. It is getting on to 1 o'clock. So thank you everyone for joining. I will hopefully see you again in November. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Just wanted to ask a question to Alexandra. I was wondering if you have found any information about the legal rights of women and especially married women in terms of property, like can married women own property on their own, or do their money belong to them or not?
Yes, so there's a lot of nuances. So they can have some property of their own, but there are like some limits. Let's see if I can find an example really quick. I find that really interesting myself. It seemed, based on my interpretation of the code, it seems like women were allowed to be like retail merchants. So I assume they could sort of like run shops, but they still had to submit to the authority of their husbands in terms of contracts and financial matters. So it's sort of a question mark to me how much power they actually had over the work they were doing and the money that they earned doing it. And I'm also interested how often people like filed a suit to sort of like deal with these matters if they were not sort of like upper class people. So let's see. I'm gonna have to look to if you want to put your email in the chat, I'll send you a key example of maybe something you could be looking out for, like the key terms, and then maybe like an example, because I'm not finding it. I'm working in Google Docs right now, and the search function is stalling. So, but I know there's an example of exactly what you're asking about. And there are definitely multiple articles that deal with this topic. So if you're interested, you should take a look.
Okay, maybe I'll write my email on the chat in case you find
That'd be
some.
perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, thanks for asking. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I will hopefully see you again mid-November. Thanks so much, Alexandra. Have a good afternoon.